Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Learn About Limerence webinar series. This webinar is titled, What Causes Limerence? My name is Rachel Wood, and I am the founder of a ministry organization called Lord Over Limerence. If you'd like to learn more about the organization, I recommend watching the first episode of this series, in which I give a brief overview of the organization as well as a primer for what limerence is. You can also visit our website at lordoverlimerence.org. I consider myself to be a limerence survivor, so limerence is a topic that is close to my heart. Some other key things to know about me are that I'm an electrical engineer by occupation, singer-songwriter, and cat lover, and I try to make people happy with the little things in life. For our agenda, I'll first go over the progression of an episode of Limerence, which is seen in three main stages. Then we'll consider some fictional characters and historical figures who likely experienced limerence. Finally, we'll discuss some causal factors that contribute to a person experiencing limerence. Please keep in mind as we go through the presentation that this webinar series is focused on the emotional and spiritual aspects of limerence more than the psychology or neuroscience. Those fields of study are certainly important to complete the picture of what causes limerence, but they are better covered by other forums. Now, let's dive into what the typical progression of an episode of limerence looks like. The Marriage Helper website describes three main stages of limerence. These are called infatuation, crystallization, and deterioration. Stage 1, infatuation, is when a person who is prone to limerence begins to perceive that another specific person has the potential to meet some need. In the limerence support community, this is also known informally as the glimmer, so called because it feels like a spotlight is beaming down on the other person, as if to say, this is what you have needed all along. Crystallization is the process of the limerent individual's development of dependence on the other person. Comparing limerence to more widely understood addictions, this would be equivalent to transitioning from a purely voluntary consumption of alcohol or a drug, or participation in an addicting activity such as gambling or gaming, to what feels like an absolute need for it. Thus, crystallization is the stage in which the limerent individual begins to be consumed with obsessive thoughts about the object of their limerence and do everything in his or her power to be near that person and secure reciprocation. Deterioration is the third and final stage of limerence, which starts when one of two things happens. Sometimes limerence is mutual and it stabilizes into a normal romantic love relationship. More often, however, the limerent individual is forced to accept rejection from his or her limerence object. From there, the obsession and dependence dissipate over time as rational judgment returns, and he or she comes to terms with the reality of the situation, including any flaws they may have previously overlooked in their limerence objects. How long it takes for the deterioration to complete is highly dependent on how willing the limerent individual is to move on and what triggers might be present in the process of letting go. What does each of these stages look like in a real limerence episode? It's different for everyone, of course, but I'll offer some examples. Infatuation is typically the shortest stage because it usually doesn't take long for the initial attraction to take root. Often the first meeting between the limerent individual and limerence object results in infatuation, a strong interest in getting to know the other person better and develop a relationship with him or her. Maybe they meet at a party or at school or work. Wherever they first encounter each other, an instant fascination takes place. There's a spark in the heart that cannot be ignored. That is infatuation. Other times, as in my own most intense experience with limerence, the glimmer happens with someone the individual already knows. In such cases, a previously ordinary acquaintanceship suddenly transforms into a potential romantic relationship that is extremely attractive. For me, it was because this acquaintance had a similar personality as the one I had loved before, and it suddenly occurred to me that I could pursue the acquaintance instead, since I couldn't be with my former love. We all have a type we love, one might say, and he matched the type I preferred rather perfectly. Stage 2, crystallization, tends to be the longest, as the person in limerence develops a strong emotional attachment to his or her limerence object. The limerent person seeks out any and every way to form a romantic relationship with his or her limerence object. If at school, certain elective classes may be chosen, and if at work, he or she may try to get assigned to the same projects and tasks to spend more time in the limerence object's presence. Words and attire are carefully selected, and sometimes conversations are even rehearsed by limerent people to make themselves appear more attractive and increase the chances of moving forward with the relationship. They are at their happiest around their love interests, and have trouble concentrating on anything else when they are distanced from them. One should not expect sound judgment from them because every decision takes into account, most importantly, how it would affect their relationship or potential relationship with their limerence objects. The duration of the crystallization phase is prolonged by uncertainty and insecurity about how the limerence object feels. It's a cycle of risk and reward, wherein the risk is rejection, but the reward of reciprocation is considered worth taking that chance. Deterioration is the third and final stage of limerence, which starts either when the relationship morphs into a healthy one, based on mutual love, or it becomes clear that there is no chance of a romantic relationship taking place. The length of this stage is highly dependent upon how deep the limerent individual's emotional involvement was with the limerence object, as well as how willing he or she is to do the work necessary to move on. It does take a significant effort to break free, so the more emotionally weary the person at the point of deterioration, the longer it will probably take to recover. However, if some distance can be maintained between the limerent person and his or her limerence object, and insofar as other triggers can be avoided, it generally becomes easier. This is not to say that cutting off contact altogether is the best starting point, but limited contact is usually helpful in restoring mental and emotional order. Now, let's consider some fictional characters and historical figures who exhibited limerent behaviors. The first fictional character that comes to mind as having experienced limerence is Pip from Great Expectations. He first met his love interest, Estella, at the elderly and wealthy Miss Havisham's mansion. Estella acted at times very coldly toward him because Miss Havisham, who had adopted her, raised her to toy with men's hearts. It was sort of a vicarious way of getting revenge on her fiancé, who had left her at the altar. However, Estella also allowed Pip to kiss her after he won a fight with another boy who had visited the mansion. The hot and cold nature of their relationship undoubtedly fueled the flame Pip held for Estella. Eventually, Estella married another man, which broke Pip's heart, but he never stopped loving her. After her husband, who had been abusive toward her, died, she had a change of heart, and at the end of the book, she was holding hands with Pip. So ultimately, it was a happy ending for him, but for most of the story, he suffered from unrequited love and limerence toward her. Next, Dante's affection toward Beatrice was limerent in nature as well. Here is a man who met Beatrice only twice in his life, but she influenced him long after her death, including inspiring major parts of some of his greatest literary works, including La Vita Nuova and the Divine Comedy. Though they they had never more than an acquaintanceship, he praised her highly in La Vita Nuova, and the fact that her character guides the Dante in the Divine Comedy into heaven implies how heavenly she is, or rather how happy life is with her in it. A third fictional example in literature is from Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Heathcliff's affection toward Catherine never waned, though he and she both married other people. After Catherine's death, he was so distraught that he even dug up her grave and danced with her dead body. Heathcliff's behavior is a pretty good example of how destructive limerence can be to the heart and mind of the person who suffers from it. The last fictional example I'll give is from the Nickelodeon TV show called Hey Arnold. This show was very popular in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I personally grew up watching it. Helga falls in love with Arnold when he is kind to her by sharing his umbrella after she got caught in the rain. She had neglectful parents and was trying to walk to preschool all by herself, so his kindness left a lasting impression. Although she treated him poorly to deflect her true feelings, she secretly loved him obsessively, keeping a locket with his picture inside. And she even built a shrine to him made out of used bubblegum. Truth be told, I considered her my inspiration for the obsessive affection I harbored toward my own love interests. To finish off this section, we'll also review some biblical characters that displayed signs of limerence. Since these stories may be less familiar than the others, I'll first summarize them, then comment on where limerent behaviors are shown. First, the story of Amnon and Tamar, found in 2 Samuel 13. Amnon was one of the great King David's sons, who fell in love with his brother Absalom's sister Tamar. He loved her so much he was tormented by it, because she was a virgin and he could not do anything to her. Eventually, his friend asked why he looked so sick day after day, and being very crafty, suggested a way he could arrange to be with her. Amnon took his friend's advice, and when he was alone with her, he first gave her a chance to give her virginity willingly. When she said no and offered an alternative for him to be with her in the proper way by asking her father, he forced himself on her. Sadly, once he did that, he began to hate her even more than he had loved her before that happened. We can see limerence here in the obsessiveness and anguish with which Amnon loved Tamar initially, and how he was not going to let anything stop him from getting what he wanted once it was within reach. What may have influenced his limerent behaviors is a sense of neglect because his father had so many wives and children, in addition to the busy life of a king. At first, he may have felt a need to form an emotional attachment with her, which was then overpowered by physical desire. He may also have felt a need to exercise control over things, and it was easy enough to control Tamar once he was alone with her. The other biblical story I'll mention is about Michal and David, written in multiple chapters between 1 Samuel 18 and 2 Samuel 6. Michal is the only woman recorded in Scripture to have loved a man, and that man was David. She was allowed to marry him because it afforded her father, Saul, who was king of Israel at the time, some political benefit. David was growing in popularity due to his successes against the Israelite enemies, the Philistines, so Saul wanted to keep him close and prevent uprising against his kingdom. When Saul learned of Michal's love for David, it pleased him to arrange their marriage. Unfortunately for Michal, David never fully returned her love, even though she once saved his life by helping him escape when Saul was about to kill him. After that, Saul ended their marriage and gave her to another man, a man who loved her with his whole heart. Some years later, David remembered Michal and sent for her to be brought back to him. when it was beneficial for him politically to defend against those who were still loyal to Saul. Her new husband begged for her to stay, but David took her anyway. The last we see of Michal is when she begins to hate him because he was dancing in an undignified way in front of the people. She never had any children, which was considered a curse in her culture, but also can be seen as a blessing in that she did not have further ties to a man who did not love her the way she had loved him. Limerence might be seen in the initial endurance of Michal's love for David. He was largely indifferent toward her, but she probably hoped she could change his heart someday as she tended to him and as he got to know her. Also, when she was married to another man, presumably at first she wished she could go back to David, but it took years for David to send for her, and it only happened when it suited him. After experiencing life with a loving husband and recognizing David's flaws, any limerence she may have had toward him came to a swift end. As for what may have caused her affection for David in the first place, certainly she respected him for his victories over Israel's enemies, but she also appreciated his good heart. The combination of uncertainty and hope that he would love her more with time would have played into the limerence as well. Finally, the topical question of this webinar episode: what causes limerence? There's no easy answer that applies in every instance, but we'll review some causal factors. Perhaps the most major external causal factor of limerence is our society and culture. There is such a huge emphasis on romance, true love, the happy ever after, that it has become ingrained in us as something many of us feel we need to be happy. It would be difficult to turn on the radio for more than 20 minutes and not hear a song that is related to a romantic relationship in some way. As a singer-songwriter, I find music to be especially powerful as an outlet for my emotions, which of course were very strong in limerence. Taylor Swift is one of the best current examples of musical artists who sing about love and relationships. She herself wrote in the song Blank Space that she has a long list of ex-lovers, and often each new relationship lends itself to at least one new song. Of course, she is only one of many who focus on romantic relationships for the majority of their music output. From older generations, I think of Pat Benatar with her song Love is a Battlefield, and Frankie Valli's lead vocals on Can't Take My Eyes Off You. In the world of film and TV, Sweet Home Alabama comes to mind as one movie on the growing list of romantic comedies. It's my favorite because of how it reminded me of my childhood best friend, who was also the love of my life. There are also the numerous adaptations of the story of Cinderella, which have influenced many young girls to wish for a prince to come save them from their lonely lives. In recent decades, we've seen several reality TV shows based on singles hoping to find the one or their soulmate, such as The Bachelor and Married at First Sight. Almost everyone wants to believe the one is out there somewhere, just waiting to be found. We've already considered some examples from literature, but another one I'll mention is Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, the pinnacle of love stories. This story is so well known that some people grow up longing to find their own Romeo or Juliet. And finally, symbols of romantic love are found in visual art, such as paintings and sculptures. Classical mythology in Roman, Greek, and Hindu cultures includes equivalents of the gods of love, desire, affection, and attraction. Cupid, Eros, and Kamadeva, respectively. The details of the depictions have changed over the years, but the concept remains the same, that sometimes, if only seemingly, an external force influences the beginning of a romantic pursuit. Even today, we often see Cupid portrayed on TV in Valentine's Day specials, and in Valentine's cards available in stores. All these societal and cultural influences add up to an almost unconscious vulnerability to limerence if other causal factors are also present in a person's life. This next causal factor is a very sensitive subject, but from what I have seen in the limerence support community, it seems to be applicable in at least 75 to 80% of limerent individuals. Childhood trauma in its various forms is a major environmental factor in leading to limerence. While it is not applicable in every case, where it is, it has left a profound impact that makes an individual more at risk of developing limerence later, if they have not already experienced it during childhood as well. That raises another question too, as an aside. What determines when in a person's life limerence will start? Sometimes it starts in early childhood, sometimes in teenage years and young adulthood, sometimes in middle age and beyond. It is unique to every person's experience. But one common factor, I believe, is that something is missing or lacking in the individual's life. They may be self-aware of it as a distinct feeling of emptiness or loneliness, or it may come to their attention as soon as they see it in their limerence objects. Returning to the subject of childhood trauma, different types of trauma can predispose a person to limerence in different ways. If the person's parents divorce at an age they can remember but not fully understand, say approximately ages 4 to 12 years, this can lead to a couple of opposing outcomes. Some may respond with a lack of desire to make any commitments in relationships, thinking that love never lasts. They become fickle and may be considered players that are not interested in marriage or any long-term romantic relationship. Others will seek commitment early in every relationship and may be seen by their partners as overly needy. The latter response is generally more indicative of a propensity toward limerence. Neglect from the child's caregivers or guardians, or physical and emotional abuse during childhood also weighs heavily into some individuals' experiences with limerence. Depending on the level of neglect or abuse, whether consistent or intermittent, this frequently results in some form of insecure attachment. Where neglect or abuse is more consistent, the attachment tends to be of the avoidant style, while intermittent neglect or abuse commonly leads to anxious attachment. Anxious attachment contributes to the uncertainty that fuels limerence. It's less commonly discussed, but religious teachings and principles can sometimes strengthen limerence as well. The concept of perseverance, pressing on despite adversity and difficulty, contributes to continuing the pursuit of one's limerence object in the face of perceived rejection. I won't give up because my persistence may lead to the ultimate reward of his heart being mine, one might think. Another potentially limerence reinforcing teaching is that love never fails, as written in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. In other words, true love never dies. In limerence, we consider ourselves to be in true love. Mutual or not, it is real, and in our minds it will last forever, because it overcomes all odds and always wins in the end. One last biblical principle I think sometimes prolongs limerence is the encouragement to be content in all circumstances, as the Apostle Paul writes in Philippians 4:11. This may seem counterintuitive because one might naturally think this means letting go of the limerence object. It is true that should be the goal of applying this verse, but it can have the opposite effect. I'll use my own experience as an example. Naturally, I am very quiet, shy, and sensitive. I was taught to be content with the many blessings I enjoyed, and to find solace in the fact that God works all things together for good. As a result, I became hesitant to express any kind of displeasure about my life. So many others around the world faced hunger, thirst, homelessness, and other hardships daily, while my struggles were largely internal. This led to me writing my negative feelings into songs rather than speaking them to any live human being. Outwardly, I tried to remain content and joyful, but inwardly, as my limerence intensified, I became depressed and miserable. Yet I could not reveal this to anyone because they couldn't understand why I couldn't let go. And secrecy has its own way of reinforcing addictive behavior, so attempting to appear content led to stronger limerence. So, in the midst of a limerence episode, certain religious principles can reinforce limerence to a degree. However, it is vitally important to realize that the truth in these same passages can help one overcome limerence. Perseverance to break free from the madness, the unfailing love of God that provides everything we need and everything we ask when we ask in accordance with His heart, and the ability to be content even in difficulty or when we seem to have nothing the world considers good, because having Christ is far greater. When everything else seems out of control, of these things someone suffering can limerence can be sure. Let's review a few takeaways. First, limerence occurs in three main stages: infatuation, crystallization, and deterioration, where crystallization is typically the longest and most intense. Next, people have experienced limerence from ancient times to today, as seen in historical artifacts, classical literature, and the continued prominence of artworks dedicated to the experience of love and romance. Finally, causal factors of limerence include the influence of society and culture, traumatic experiences in childhood, and certain religious teachings and principles. On that last point, coming from a Christian perspective, I would be remiss not to emphasize again the ability of many of the same principles to help a person move past limerence as well. It simply requires understanding the true intent of the passage. That closes the last section on the agenda, but you can refer to this slide for the registration link to the final webinar in this series titled, How Can I Help Someone Who is Experiencing Limerence? Remember, if you are unable to attend the live session, you can still register and receive an email when the recording is available to view. Thank you again for joining, everyone. I hope you have learned and/or resonated with some things. If you have any questions, I will pause for a moment and check the chat box for any that may have come in during the presentation. Not seeing any, I will leave it here. My contact information is on the screen, so please feel free to reach out as any questions come to mind. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great rest of your day.